Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session. At that time, if you would like to ask a question over the phone, you may do so by pressing star then one. You may press star two to withdraw your request. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would like to turn the call over to Mr. Leland Milstein. Sir, you may begin.
Great. Thanks very much. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for the third Thursday webcast about planning your way to the best urban forest. The third Thursday webcast series is a monthly webcast held at the lunch hour. The trainings leverage local successes by amplifying to a larger audience two model organizations' methods, materials, and approaches. Sessions are planned to last no more than 1 hour, with two presenters speaking on the same topic from slightly different perspectives, each for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. This session is approved by the ISA for 1 CEU hour and by SAF for 1 CFE Category 1. If you haven't already given me your certification number, please email me after the session. My email is Leland, L-E-L-A-N-D, @actrees.org. Most state landscape architecture boards require only a certificate of completion, which ACT can provide to you if you request one. So again, email me on that if you want. This is a program of the Alliance for Community Trees. Please consider joining if you're not a member already. I want to thank our sponsors who make this possible, the Home Depot Foundation and the U.S. Forest Service. Today's session is Planning Your Way to the Best Urban Forest. The physical framework of a community is called its infrastructure and can be divided into two types, green and gray. Gray infrastructure refers to the areas of buildings, roads, utilities, and parking lots. Green infrastructure includes areas covered with trees, shrubs, and grass. A community can measure the size, shape, and location of its green infrastructure and can accurately calculate the public utility functions these areas perform, although cities are only just now starting to value green infrastructure for more than its beauty. For local public policymakers responsible for decisions affecting urbanization, the problem is not solely about getting the city or a developer to plant more trees, but rather one of balancing gray and green infrastructure. Here today to tell us more about these and give us a guide to planning our way to the best urban forest are Jim Schwab of APA and Cheryl Collin, who is a consultant at American Forests. First up this afternoon is Jim Schwab, who has served as at the APA and was project editor and lead author for Planning the Urban Forest, Ecology, Economy, and Community Development, a planning advisory service report that the American Planning Association produced in partnership with American Forests and with the International Society of Arboriculture, along with funding from the U.S. Forest Service. Jim is a senior research associate for APA and manager of its Hazards Planning Research Center, in which capacity he has led numerous APA research and training projects related to natural hazards and disaster recovery. Jim is also co-editor of the APA monthly publication, Zoning Practice. Thanks for being with us today, Jim.
Thank you, Leland. I've titled this short talk, Smart Growth Through Urban Forestry, because really what we're going to focus on is the way that we can intelligently design trees and green infrastructure into a smart community and derive numerous environmental, social, and economic benefits from doing so. What I want to start with is the issue of understanding a bit of history and perspective that we need to bring to this issue so that we understand just how much opportunity lies in front of us. And to do that, I'm going to suggest just trying to imagine what the U.S. was actually like. Some of us are old enough to remember, before the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was created, which was back in 1970. An awful lot of progress has been made since then in terms of waves of environmental legislation over the years. In the meantime, we've learned more about some crucial issues that were only faint blips on the landscape at the time, such as climate change. 10 years ago, climate change was still struggling to get serious public attention. today it's pretty much accepted that it's a necessary priority of public policy on the international scale, as well as many communities that are looking at how they can mitigate and adapt to climate change. And the important thing with regard to the urban forest is that it's not too long ago that for most communities that was simply a nice aesthetic option to spend some money on, but not necessarily seen as an integral part of the community's well-being. And as we all know, money doesn't grow on trees, but in fact, we can reposition trees as a strategic public investment, change the public thinking about what spending money on the urban forest is really all about, because it's really a money saver in the long run, and with lots of environmental and social psychological benefits to boot. We've learned that we can use it to reduce stormwater runoff, to filter air pollution, to reduce stream bank erosion, improving water quality in our streams and rivers, reducing building energy consumption because of the shading capacity of trees, and various other ways in which we can improve the urban quality of life. And so in the end, what we're really doing is making Ben Franklin there proud of us by taking something as ordinary as a tree and turning it into a symbol of fiscal responsibility. In this project, we partnered with a few organizations, and of course Cheryl Collin, who will speak after me, worked with American Forest and was a major contributor to this report, also had major underwriting from the Forest Service and ISA. When we started the project back about almost 3.5 years ago, one of the things we wanted to do was figure out ways to make clear to people that there were major benefits in the urban forest, and we chose this photo as a bit of a motto or mascot on our website because it raises the question of what it is that's so appealing about that image that would help sell trees as a popular option and drive public policy in the right direction. And we had to decide what exactly we meant by urban forestry, and so I'm going to just go quickly through this little definition that we finally ended up with in the report, which borrows from a number of other people's definitions and just tweaks it a little in the direction of planning. But we decided that it was a planned and programmatic approach to the development and maintenance of the urban forest, and that word maintenance is very important, including all elements of green infrastructure within the community in an effort to optimize the resulting benefits. And that's another key word. This is all about benefits in social, environmental, public health, economic, and aesthetic terms. And then finally, a third key point, especially when resulting from a community visioning and goal-setting process. In other words, getting people involved in the public process of learning what their options are, learning what the benefits of urban forestry are, and what the costs of a good program are, and understanding what the balance of the equation is and how it weighs in favor of improving our green infrastructure. We also had to think about the audience, which, as you can see, the first audience we defined was urban planners, primarily because they're at the driver's seat of dealing with community design and site plan design, and making a lot of the decisions about development that either facilitate or impede effective urban forestry. Many of the other people on the list then kind of derive from that in terms of other kinds of decision makers. But I also want to add that we wanted to focus on the intersection between planning and urban forestry, and that meant we also had to get planners and tree professionals, foresters and arborists, talking to each other and informing each other from both sides of that perspective. We outlined some project goals. I won't go through these systematically here in the interest of time. You can read those, but I would summarize them by saying we start out in that first case by talking about why we want to do this, providing a rationale. Secondly, what to do, and that's the guidance on the principles, where I'm going to spend most of my time for the balance of my talk here. And then how to do it, which involves a lot of effort to strengthen the relationship between planners and tree professionals and other environmental professionals, as I mentioned, and involve them in some knowledge exchanges. We also had to focus on where planners actually have a chance to make a difference in this process. And so we have our 5 strategic points of intervention that fall into 2 categories. One is adopting a green infrastructure approach to plan making by building it into the community visioning process, which I already mentioned, and all sorts of long-range plan making. And here we're not only talking about the comprehensive plan of the community, but also other opportunities for long-range plan making, such as area plans for neighborhoods or downtowns or corridors, as well as functional plans for specific functions that are involved in the community, such as transit and sewer and so on. And sometimes there are opportunities, sometimes there may not be, but we need to look thoroughly to find out where our opportunities do lie to advance the cause. The second half of this is the implementation, which is really critical. Ordinances just don't self-enforce in the first place. And it's very important to write those ordinances properly. It's important to put tree ordinances in your development codes where developers are going to see them and understand what's expected of them. But it's also important in that second point there about review and approval of applications for development to understand that after that ordinance is written, when you're dealing with people at the permit desk at City Hall, to make sure that trees get their fair share of attention and that the provisions that are made for protecting trees do get enforced and that you have adequate personnel to take care of that. And finally, that last point, capital improvements, to make sure that the money flows in the right direction to actually get the job done. We did a series of case studies. You can see a few of these. Cheryl's going to talk about a couple of those momentarily. But we actually chose 13 scattered around the country. They had various strengths that they brought to the table. They all obviously adapt to local circumstances. They have different situations that they have to deal with. We'll get into that in a second. We also did a chapter at the beginning of the book on bringing nature into the city. And obviously I talked about that definition. There's the issue of why it matters, which gets into that whole business of making sure that we explain benefits properly to the public, understanding who the players are. Now, this is not only the planners and foresters, tree professionals that I mentioned, but also understanding how to convey these issues properly to developers, to citizens, and to elected officials, and what role they play in building public support for effective urban forestry. And then we need to understand our challenges and opportunities. Primarily what I'm going to finish with here, though, is the principles that we outlined that we divided into 3 categories: general principles, planning principles, and design principles, to get down from the general to the specific. I apologize, that second one actually is 2 separate things, and it somehow bumped up against each other. Think out private partners is the third point there. There are actually 5. You see also that we had talked about how investing in trees makes economic sense. This brings us back to that fiscal aspect that I talked about earlier, that we need to reposition trees as a strategic public investment that eventually saves us money on environmental compliance costs in the long run. And at the same time, we must make the urban forestry sustainable financially by finding the right resources. And in many cases, some of our case studies involve communities that found good enterprising ways to raise money for their urban forestry programs. The most important thing right at the top with the planning principles, again, incorporating the tree ordinance in the development code so that developers actually see this thing and it's not a surprise later in the process for them. That second point really relates to just getting everybody potentially interested at the table or at public meetings to really educate the public about the benefits of what we're trying to do and build strong public support so that we sort of bake that consensus into the community character that urban forestry is a necessary part of the community. Those last 3 points really all kind of tie together in a way that we have to pay attention to making sure we have the enforcement personnel and the resources to ensure long-term maintenance of the urban forest, that we don't plant trees that die a year later and then think we did a good thing. The design principles get us down to the individual sites and how things work. That second point there about a green infrastructure element is something that we actually have done out in Baltimore County. He's a longtime environmental planner there to develop a model for how communities can create an element of their comprehensive plan that addresses the needs for green infrastructure. And then that last point about making the place right for trees was one that our forestry friends certainly emphasized as we were developing this project. And it really involves an understanding of both what are the kinds of conditions that you need to create in the community to allow trees to survive, and then understanding which trees are likely to survive in those conditions. And I believe Cheryl's going to be talking about that in a couple of her case studies here. But in the bigger picture, too, I want to also take this little mouse and run it along that blue line that you see here. One of our case studies, Maryland, Baltimore County, involves a really broad-ranging effort that incorporates the best of urban planning principles with an understanding of sustainable forestry. That line is called the urban-rural demarcation line, and it's basically the area to the south of it within which they try to contain growth so as to maintain the most survivable and healthy forests up here and reduce the amount of storm water, try to improve water quality going into the Chesapeake Bay. There's a whole range of environmental issues that we could talk about there if only we had 3 hours to do it. So here's a list of our case studies, and with that, I'm just going to mention that obviously, as I said, we have that green infrastructure plan. We have a CD-ROM version of this report, and it is time to let Cheryl take over after we take a few questions.
All right. Thanks very much, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to take a few questions now on all this from the audience, and I'm going to have Michelle, our operator, give us instructions on how to do that.
Thank you. If you'd like to ask a question, please press star then 1. You will be prompted to record your first and last name. To withdraw your request, you may then press star 2. Once again, for any questions over the phone, please press star 1 at this time. One moment, please.
I also want to remind everyone that you can also ask your questions online through the Microsoft Office Live Meeting program under that Q&A tab at the top. While people are formulating their questions, I want to just start out with one for you, Jim.
Okay.
I was at a talk last week where a city forester from Oregon was talking about the problems he's had in his area working with planners, and often there'll be a new, or with construction companies redeveloping an area, and there'll be a new development that's going up, and they have started to build, and they'll call him in and say, oh, what can we do about this tree? And now it's sort of too late. So I'm wondering, clearly, as you say, we need to have more communication, strengthened relationship between planners and management, developers, and foresters. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how to sort of speed up that, or to facilitate that communication so that, or that education maybe, so that people will know to call, say, a forester before the planning is finished, before construction has begun.
Sure. We actually addressed some of that in the report. A lot of what we focused on overall in the report was the process of integrating urban forest concerns into the entirety of the planning process so that a lot of that gets dealt with and the structure is put in place before you get to that stage where somebody's already building something and then you call in an urban forester after the fact. It ought not to be an afterthought, because at that point, if you haven't got the regulations in place, if you haven't got the incentives in place, you're simply at the mercy of the developer as to whether he feels like doing this. What we do advocate.
This is the operator, Mr. Liu. Are you still connected?
We are.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there was just some sort of loud noise that came in there. What we do advocate is that we build the forestry expert, whether that be an arborist or an urban forester, into the process of reviewing development applications so that they have a role to play in approving that development before it happens. and also ideally having the authority if a tree protection provision is not being complied with on a development site to go out there and say, this has to stop until we get this fixed. But we have to have those things in place before that development all starts, and ideally we have it even before we start writing ordinances, have gone through a comprehensive planning process that includes some serious attention to the overall goals of the community with regard to green infrastructure.
Michelle? I was wondering if there are any questions in queue. Thanks very much, Jim.
There are no questions over the phone at this time.
All right. Well, I wanted to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. Just press star one if you have any questions.
Great. Thanks. I wanted to ask one over the web. This one from Scott Jameson, who wants to know if you looked at how cities are dealing with coordinating agencies within the city on protecting the urban tree canopy. For example, water departments coordinating with streets, so that interagency communication.
Yes, that's actually a very important question, and that's part of what we were also talking about. When I mentioned the coordination between, for instance, planners and foresters, it's very common actually for the forestry division of a community to be embedded in something like its public works agency. And so you get this interface between the planning department and public works over these kinds of issues. That's certainly some of the case studies illustrate that very point. For instance, in Urbana, Illinois, one of our case studies, the forester, the city, his title is actually the city arborist, but then he's got a staff under him, is actually part of the public works division. And so there's coordination with both the public works director, most of whose staff obviously is engineers, as well as with that individual. And there are various ways of organizing city bureaucracies. Every city does its own thing, but certainly those kinds of coordination issues are very important, and particularly where utilities are involved, because then you're getting into things like maintaining trees around power lines, where the power lines are going to go, things like that. So all of those issues are quite important.
Great. I also have another question here from Scott. Wants to know actually how to get the CD-ROM.
You can order the material online from planningbooks.com, which is APA's book outlet. So just go there and look up Planning the Urban Forest.
Great. Thank you. Are there any questions in queue over the phone?
None at this time.
All right. In that case, I think what we're going to do is move on to Cheryl Collins, who is the consultant for the Urban Ecosystem Center at American Forests in Washington, D.C., after having served there for 16 years. She's the landscape architect with 25 years' experience in the field of urban forestry in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Ms. Collins provides applied research to the environmental and economic benefits of urban ecosystems to foster change in urban planning and public policy. She's a contributing author to this report, Planning the Urban Forest, Ecology, Economy, and Community Development. She recently received her MBA in Sustainable Business at the Bainbridge Graduate Institute and also consults in the local food movement. She holds a master's in landscape architecture from the University of California and a bachelor's of science from the University of Michigan. Thanks for being with us, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Leland, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and the question that Leland asked at first really leads right into my presentation, talking about how not to make trees an afterthought. And what I wanted to focus on today was how you frame the planning issues with green infrastructure, which means that they're not an afterthought, but that they're really one of the impetuses of the planning focus of whatever a community's concerned with or interested in. And so when we think about framing issues from a planning perspective, we can think about some of the top issues of the day. Some of our communities are facing issues of urban decay. They're having to contend with outdated or overwhelmed sanitary storm sewers, water supply, things like that. And so communities are asking themselves, well, how do we start to revitalize our cities, our communities? Other communities, like Palm Beach, Florida, have to contend with natural disasters, anything from a hurricane, a flood. In the Midwest, lots of ice issues, obviously in California, fire issues. And so then the question is, what about resiliency, and how do we rebuild our communities so that they become more resilient? And then a lot of communities are dealing with urban sprawl and urban growth. Communities have gotten so big that it's eating up the natural landscape, and people are questioning the quality of life. So then the issue becomes, how do we grow more sustainably? So these are a lot of issues that planners and communities, public officials are contending with. And what I'd like to focus in on is, how do we reframe these issues, thinking about incorporating green infrastructure? So for instance, when we talk about urban sprawl, how do we start to think about smart growth and incorporating trees, urban forests, green infrastructure into smart growth planning? We want to think about not only cleaning up after a natural disaster, but how do you build that resiliency into the environment so that there's less to clean up after a natural disaster. And instead of traditional developments, some communities are starting to plan using conservation development and really using green infrastructure, incorporating that into the built environment. Likewise, instead of just designing and building infrastructure with hardscape, a lot of communities are turning toward vegetation and non-engineered best management practices. And also, rather than going from a regulatory stick approach, how might communities build in incentives to the development and planning process? And then also, as we realize how all of these issues interrelate, connect, that they no longer are really single issues, but they're really needing to take on a systems approach. So it's not just a natural disaster, it's not just a flood, but it's all of these above. And how do we start to think about these from a systematic approach? So while I'd love to spend all day chatting about each one of these things, with the time that we have, I'd like to focus on the first two, talking about some smart growth and show you a case study from the past report, and then also talk about looking at building resiliency into the environment. And then I would certainly invite everybody to get a copy of the past report and dig in and read about some of these other ways that we talk about reframing these issues. So first, I'd like to offer a case study from the city of Detroit and planning greenways within the city. And this really helps communities to think about incorporating more smart growth into rebuilding cities. So with the city of Detroit, we have some interesting statistics. Between 1950 and 1990, Detroit lost half of its tree canopy cover to Dutch elm disease, and I'm sure other communities have their own stories of how Dutch elm disease has decimated urban communities through the Midwest and the East Coast over the last several decades. And now, unfortunately, the emerald ash borer is wreaking havoc in many cities around the country, and in Detroit, they count 16 million trees and counting. At the same time, Detroit has 66,000 vacant lots, and what they're seeing is this migration from the city to suburbs and seeing a lot of urban decay. So the city has a lot of issues to contend with, and they're starting to think about, what are some of the best ways to rebuild. And one of the great things about the city of Detroit is that as developable land dwindles and land costs rise, that people are starting to recognize the importance and value of infill housing and redevelopment, which of course is a smart growth approach. So the question then is, how do you best incorporate green infrastructure into redevelopment? And you can imagine with 56,000 vacant lots, you could literally draw a greenway through those vacant lots and establish a wonderful greenway system through the city, and that's what the planners have envisioned. So let me give you one example. The DeQuinder Cut Greenway is a proposed redesign of an abandoned railroad right-of-way. You can see that in the photo up above. And then here. And then the proposed plan, as you can see, actually touches into the Detroit River waterfront and goes inland like this. And the idea in cross-section, at least the designer's viewpoint, is to take that abandoned railroad right-of-way and make it both into public transportation and a proposed pedestrian bike throughway. And while there is some existing vegetation along these banks and steep areas of the greenway, what American Forest did is we looked at how the addition of trees in urban forest cover would impact ecologically and economically impact the area as a whole, and what some of those benefits are. So we did what we call an urban ecosystem analysis, and that's looking at geographic information systems as a tool using satellite imagery and aerial photography, and incorporating different formulas to quantify those ecological and economic benefits of increasing the urban forest canopy. So we know that for let me move back one slide. I think I got ahead of myself here. There's one slide that's not showing up. Okay. So we have the DeQuinder Cut Greenway, and we figured out what the ecological and economic benefits are. And then we said, well, what would happen if all of the greenways that planners are envisioning for the city of Detroit, you can see those outlined in red, and what would happen if all of those greenways were built? What would be the ecological and economic impact? So we know that the greenway system as it exists is about 3,000 acres, and that's measuring 150-foot vegetation buffer on either side of the greenway. The greenway system has a current 19% tree canopy cover, and that the current value is $7.6 million in stormwater management value. Now, if the canopy were increased in density all along the greenway to 25%, we calculated that would save an additional $2 million in stormwater management value. And so the different community groups, the Greening of Detroit and the City of Detroit Planning Department are looking at this not only from a design perspective, but also trying to then build their case for greening and actually building out these greenways from, as Jim was saying, making that dollar value case for how important these greenways are. So it's not just a matter of recreation, but it's also a matter of money, saving money in stormwater management value, and providing improving that quality of living within the city. For those of you who have visited Palm Beach, Florida, or know the area well, you know that it is part of the Everglades ecosystem, a beautiful community, Palm Beach County. The county stretches, the ecosystem itself, that Everglades ecosystem stretches from the numerous lakes in central Florida south all the way down to the Florida Keys, and this represents a unique U.S. ecoregion. We know that this area is characterized by flooded grasslands and a very rich wildlife that encompasses the county's 1/2 million acre natural areas. And these natural areas are really critical for protecting the county's drinking water, as well as providing a thriving agriculture business and tourism industries. The county, unfortunately, though, is also subject to annual tropical storms and hurricanes, and destroys not only property, but the very green infrastructure that protects its shorelines. So you've got an interesting juxtaposition of the beauty of Palm Beach and the horror of natural disaster. So the question is, how do we go from just cleaning up natural disasters to building resiliency into the environment? So as we studied this area, we wanted to zero in, working with the planners in Palm Beach County, looking at what the impact of some recent hurricanes were within Palm Beach County. And we mapped 3 of them. You can see Hurricane Francis and Hurricane Jean hit just to the county north of Palm Beach, right here. And Hurricane Wilma actually went right through Palm Beach County. So the county was the planners were particularly interested in knowing what the impact of the vegetation was, and particularly tree canopy loss. So American Forest actually mapped this, again, using satellite imagery and GIS technology, and then quantifying the benefits of that, or I should say the loss of benefits in the urban forest using American Forest City Green software program. And what was really interesting to us as we looked at tree canopy decline between 2004 and 2006, and looking at a percentage of tree canopy loss in each one of the individual communities, the red representing the most tree canopy loss and yellow representing the least, that even though Hurricane Wilma went right through Palm Beach Gardens and West Palm Beach communities, they actually had some of the least tree canopy damage of all the communities. The ones highlighted in red right along the coast had sustained the most damage. And that was really interesting. So as we were looking at this more and more carefully and working with the planners, we saw some really interesting patterns. And what we came up with here is the areas in gray that have the red speckles represent urban areas, and the red speckles represent tree loss between 2004 and 2006. The areas in green represent natural areas that are protected by the county. And what we found fascinating was that virtually all the canopy loss during this time period happened in the urban areas. Now, we can't really say what tree canopy loss was attributed to hurricane versus development versus something else, but visually, when you look at the satellite imagery and you zoom in, and because we're looking at a very high-resolution image, you can actually visually see whether, looking at pre- and post-hurricane, whether tree loss was attributed to natural disaster. For instance, there was a golf course with trees in 2004, and then the next photo would show the same golf course with no trees. Well, that wasn't development because the golf course is still there, but you can pretty much guess that that was a natural disaster occurrence. And then contrasting that to other areas where you see, say, a natural landscape or a forested area, and then in 2 years later you see a built development, and you can pretty much guess this tree loss is due to urban development. So again, while you can't do that through the GIS per se or measuring it as a whole, you can certainly look at it visually. But I think the really important point here to keep in mind is asking ourselves, why is it that all the tree canopy loss occurred in the urban areas and not in the natural areas? And it probably doesn't come as much of a shock to a lot of you who work in urban forestry to know that any trees that are planted in natural conditions are going to be more resilient. They tend to be more native natural species. And then the trees that are planted in urban environments, which have to withstand the urban pressures of perhaps not much growing space, and then perhaps lawn irrigation and other urban problems, and then also having to deal with non-native species. And so when you put all of that together, it really becomes not much of a surprise to see this kind of pattern. But this study was really eye-opening for even the planners who kind of knew that conceptually, but this really documented that. So we quantified those changes between 2004 and 2006. Here you can see that there, in that time period, when we measured the land cover changes, there was a 6% increase in urban areas, a 17% decrease in tree canopy, and a 9% increase in open space. And again, we can't say for certain, what was attributable to natural disaster versus development. But what is interesting is that when we ran our City Green software, and we could quantify what those impacts were in terms of reducing stormwater retention capacity, losing trees' capacity to remove air pollutants, and that's measured per year, and then looking at the loss of carbon storage and a change in increase in water pollutants, increasing 2 to 4%. So those are the kinds of statistics that really help build a case for changing your ordinances, changing your public policies, and incorporating, building a case for wanting to incorporate green infrastructure into your planning process. In the case of Palm Beach County, what was really important for the planners was first to be able to provide this tangible evidence for native tree habitat. So it starts to build a base with which the planners and the community can start to realize why they should be planting more native species, why they should have less lawn around their trees, why they should not be irrigating, and especially if they have native species that are adapted to that particular area, that they're in over time with natural disaster, that this is how you start to build resiliency into your landscape. And it also helps to educate the public with these issues, because when people think, well, anytime there's a hurricane, trees are going to fall on my house, so I might as well just cut down all the trees. If we can start to build a public education campaign that shows that trees can be resilient if the correct species are chosen and maintained properly, that it doesn't have to be a fact that natural disaster means devastation of the natural landscape. So this also obviously demonstrates what are some of the best species selection. And then probably most important for the folks that we work with in the planning department was that it really ties the benefits of the county's natural areas into the regulatory mandates that they have for things like water quality, air quality, native vegetation, wildlife habitat, and this gives them that mandate for wanting to increase and maintain native vegetation. So with those two case studies, just to remind you that there's really a lot of interesting ways in which those of us who work in urban forestry can really reframe these different issues that come up in communities all the time. And so getting back to Leland's question about, let's not just think about trees as an afterthought, but let's start to integrate the green infrastructure right into the planning process and show how vital and important trees are as part of a community's entire infrastructure. And I think the past report really lays these case studies out so beautifully in showing great examples of each of these. And so with that, I encourage you all to go out, if you don't already have a copy, go out and get a copy of the book, and I'd be happy to answer some questions.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. All right. Well, I think what we're going to do now is open it up for questions and answers again. Michelle, if you'd remind everyone how to do that, please.
Thank you. Please press *1 if you'd like to ask a question. One moment.
While the questions are lining up in queue, I have one, several actually, already. First is from Janet in Toronto. She writes that up there they have a municipal private tree protection bylaw in place that requires a permit to damage or remove trees of 30 centimeters dBH and greater. But enforcement is a problem because all of their provincial laws, their building codes and planning acts don't mention trees. And so I think she's wondering if you have advice.
I think I might turn that over to Jim because it becomes more of a kind of a planning policy and ordinance kind of question. It has to do with really what you were saying earlier about integrating your tree provisions into certain planning documents so that they're not just separate documents.
Right. There's certainly a need for a thorough integration all the way through the planning system. I think there probably also, occasionally there can be a little bit of overreach when a community puts certain requirements or restrictions on the books that it has not built the capacity to enforce. And you really have to match those two things and either ask yourself, do we have the capacity to make sure that this law is complied with? And conversely, do we need more resources to get that done? Is it realistic to be able to obtain those resources? Because it is important to maintain some credibility behind those requirements so that people know that if that's on the books that it actually does mean something.
Great, thanks. I want to remind everyone that you can also ask questions online through live meeting. You can type those in through the Q&A feature right there. I have another question. This one I think deals more with the analysis that you do, Cheryl. This is from Scott Jameson. He wants to know, are there any statistics on whether it's better to maintain mature urban tree canopy or to put more energy into planting trees in order to increase the overall canopy coverage of an urban area? Clearly, both is best if you can do both, but if you can only do one.
Well, there's kind of a double-edged sword there. So on one hand, your more mature trees are going to provide more of your environmental benefits because it comes down to a matter of, what is the density of your tree canopy cover. If you think about it from flying, say, flying in a plane over a community and you look at how dense is that urban tree canopy cover, we talk about percent tree canopy cover. And American Forest has some general guidelines about, an ideal tree canopy cover. And you can look at that on the American Forest website, which is americanforest.org. And I say general guidelines because it varies very much by the geography of the part of the country you're in and the rainfall and so on. On the other hand, you can't just maintain your mature trees without renewing your tree canopy cover. Urban foresters talk a lot about how important it is to maintain different age diversity of your tree canopy. And so you always, have to keep replacing trees and having new ones come up because you don't want to have an even age stand and, if all your trees are healthy, but eventually, of course, they die, and if they all die at the same time, then you're left with, not much urban canopy. So it's important both to really do both, and you want to protect through whatever means you can, different ordinances, your mature canopy, and then also, of course, institute new tree planting. And a lot of communities who might not be able to do that all through a municipal program turn to nonprofit organizations, citizen groups, that do a lot of community tree planting.
I have a question for Cheryl about one of the slides you showed. On slide 12, it showed that Palm Beach County had lost a certain amount of stormwater capacity. Was that estimated, or was that city records going back to
no,
after the trees?
That's calculated based on the CityRean software that American Forest has developed, and that is based on looking at the Natural Resource Conservation Services data. And so we really combine, when we run a City Green analysis, we combine the NRCS formulaic data on stormwater runoff with the actual land cover of a particular area that we're looking at. So it's not measured data, but in a sense it is, in that the NRCS has provided wonderful data over 50 years. They've collected data, and that's used it's used by stormwater engineers to calculate size of pipes and things like that, and stormwater runoff over an urban area.
Thank you. Are there any questions in the queue over the phone?
There are no questions over the phone.
All right. Well, then I've got one through the computer. One of them is from Tina, who is wondering what the best management practices are to address the conflict of hazard trees and habitat trees.
Hazard trees and habitat trees.
Maybe Tina can type in a little more clarification for us.
Use a little clarification.
As she does that, I've got another question. How do you successfully plan or integrate the urban forest with increasing demand for density for humans, buildings, and other infrastructure?
That's a really good question, and it's something that I think those who are engaged with smart growth have to contend with all the time. While smart growth advocates planning for dense urban communities and infill, as we talked about in Detroit, I think you also have to balance that with having enough open space, green space, forested area to both satisfy quality of life issues for people who live there. Nobody wants to live just in an urban wasteland of concrete and asphalt, and yet you don't want to get into a sprawl situation. So I think it's a delicate balance between those two, and I think some of the best examples, and Jim, I'm sure, can offer his own ideas, but the whole notion of conservation development, I think, really touches on that issue so nicely because whereas we have one case study in the book that talks about, this is Flower Mound, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas, that is promoting conservation development. And what that means is that it's channeling their development in a bit of a smaller area. So traditional development in the Flower Mound area would be, say, 1 house per acre. And that's still, quite a lot of open space. Instead, they're promoting conservation development, which is, you might have development on half an acre of land, and then you leave the rest of the whole development site in open space and forested areas, so that you maintain the things that we talked about and the values of tree canopy cover for stormwater runoff management and air and water quality, quality of life issues. At the same time, then you're concentrating your development a bit. So it's not an either or. I think it's really a matter of both. And you can look at the town of Flower Mound, Texas, and read up about conservation development, and I think that's a really valuable way to solve that issue.
I have a question for Jim. I think a lot of people in the urban forestry community are often perplexed that everyone doesn't understand the benefits of trees. They feel like these things have been out there, or the talking points have been out there for so long, and when they approach a planner about it, they're just amazed. And the planner is as happy to get the information as the urban forestry person is to give it. But do you have any magic other than just pick up the phone and talk with your planner, in terms of how they like to receive this information, how to frame the issues, what they're looking for that communicates it a little faster?
Well, one of the things we advocated very strongly in the report was getting planners and foresters and other tree professionals talking together and planning together, exchanging information. The planners can certainly inform the tree folks about aspects of the planning process that make them more knowledgeable, understand better how the planning process works and where those strategic points of intervention are, where you can make a difference to change policy in the direction that you want to go, in this case, green infrastructure. And at the same time, the foresters and arborists can certainly do a good job of educating planners on what makes a difference for the success of the urban forest, what allows trees to survive and thrive in the midst of whatever development does need to happen within the community. So I don't see any substitute for that dialogue taking place within the community And certainly it ought to also involve the tree advocates among citizens groups and other folks that are knowledgeable. It's just a constant process of mutual education that will help to reinforce these priorities in the planning process.
Great.
And do we have any questions over the phone?
Yes, Mark Spunzik, your line is open.
Hi, I've got a question. I'm not sure for which person. How do you account for climate change? Is there a situation where the native trees will no longer be able to thrive as you're getting warmer temperatures in the south? Is that something you're looking at?
Well, I think that, you know, if it's USDA or USGS, somebody is, or I think it's I think it's NRCS actually, are redrawing their maps to show how vegetation has changed in their different climate zones. So that's really interesting. So, you know, people are actually documenting how these climate changes are affecting temperatures and then growing zones. So you may think that your area is in a certain zone, and then, you know, as they've updated the maps, these zones are changing. So I think that's kind of the best documentation of that. So I don't know that it's a matter of native versus non-native. It's just, I think it's a matter of, you know, what species are going to be best adapted to these changing conditions over time, and I think time will tell. You know, I think we're starting to see that, but yeah, I think that's a really interesting aspect of this whole climate change, and really being able to witness that in the kinds of vegetation that can grow in a particular area.
And given that loss of status or stability of the past, given the impetus of climate change, I think it's imperative that we're all going to become bigger, faster consumers of this kind of data in order to keep up with the change that we need to anticipate and to be able to better assure our success in the future.
Okay. Really quickly, one final question that is the clarification of the one from before, and this is about hazard trees and habitat trees. For trees that are along streams, the city has to protect private property and be proactive by removing potential hazard trees. But we also need to meet our habitat objectives of not removing trees in the stream habitat. And the person with the question was just wondering if you had any case studies that might give them some guidance.
Well, I think that example that I showed in Palm Beach County was really eye-opening to us in terms of how telling planting native species versus non-native species is in building that resilience. So I think the key to that is really looking at your species selection that is appropriate for your particular locale and understanding what its requirements are in terms of you know, soils, water care, things like that. And so, you know, while it might be true that hazardous trees have to be removed to maintain public safety, you know, it also depends on, you know, what might be the best tree. And again, it's kind of a balancing act, because I wouldn't just advocate that you must plant all natives either. So, you know, because there's a lot of reasons why natives don't thrive in urban areas. So the reasons why we talked about earlier, you know, irrigated lawn and things like that.
All right.
So I think I just think that you have to first, you know, strike that balance, and I think try and incorporate natives where they are appropriate, and certainly if you're going to try and maintain water quality along your stream beds, looking to natives that do well along there is a good practice.
Yeah, I would just add very quickly in 30 seconds or less here that for an interesting variation on that same kind of question about hazards versus habitat, take a look at our case study from Flagstaff, where they had to wrestle with the issues of similar kinds of issues in a wildfire-prone environment. There are some questions that people have to wrestle with in those settings as well.
And I just want to emphasize before, as we're moving towards the end, that at the Alliance for Community Trees, we think that this PAS, the Planning the Urban Forest, is such a strong publication, that we really want it to be out there with, every local urban forestry group should be using it. They should be talking with their city planners. They should be giving them the PAS. That as a renewing and new membership benefit, we give you a copy of that. So, an added incentive, but we really think this is a great publication. So, we're thrilled to have the authors here to discuss it with you.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this webcast. The presentations by Cheryl and Jim and the recorded session, as well as a resource list, will be available on our website and will be emailed out in about 1 week. Our next webcast session is Heading Towards Sustainability Part 2, Community Orchards, and that'll be on September 17th. I hope you'll join us for that as well. Right now, you should see in front of you a link to a survey. Please head over to that web address and fill out a brief survey on this webcast, and if you participate in that, we'll be able to send you the recorded session and resource list as well as the presentations. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the line for the webcast today, and a special thanks to Ian Schwab and Cheryl Collins for presenting. Also want to thank the USDA Forest Service and, of course, Home Depot Foundation for making this possible. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webcast. Have a good day.
This concludes today's conference call. You may disconnect at this time.
Michelle, do you know what happened with